Lipids have the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just like carbohydrates, but often there are a lot less oxygens than carbon and hydrogen. And unlike carbohydrates, lipids are long-term energy storage because they're so big that it takes a long time for them to break down, but they also store lots of energy. And lipids are also used for insulation, just like the fat that we have in our bodies. It helps warm us up. Lipids can also act as hormones, which we'll talk about a little bit later, because steroids are a type of lipids. And just like carbohydrates, lipids can also be cell structure components. Cholesterol is a very important part of the cell membrane, as we'll discuss very soon. And lipids don't have any monomers or polymers, and they just have parts. So lipids have glycerol and fatty acids. And this is how the glycerol and fatty acids come together to make lipids. So at the end of each of the glycerol, basically, you have in the diagram to the right, you have this basically a glycerol and then 3 fatty acid chains linked to that glycerol. And they're linked at these oxygens, you see. But before they were linked, basically there was a hydrogen attached to those green oxygens you see there. And they're attached via dehydration synthesis. So it's the same exact process through which these fatty acid chains are linked to the glycerol. And these linkages are called ester bonds. Now, there are many types of lipids. So you have your fats, your oils, your phospholipids, your waxes, and steroids. Fats and oils are just your glycerol with 1 to 3 fatty acids, and depending on that, it's either called a monoglyceride, diglyceride, or triglyceride. And there are 2 types of these fats and oils. You have unsaturated fats and oils and saturated fats and oils. So here's the difference, essentially. In the saturated fatty acid, you just have a very straight chain of hydrocarbons, which is just like HCH, HCH, HCH. And on either end, you have this carboxyl functional group, which is the COOH. And on the right side, you have that lonely hydrogen. And we'll talk about what the carboxyl group does a bit later. But otherwise, the saturated fatty acid is like completely straight, and it can stack on top of other saturated fatty acids really easily, which makes it a really solid sort of molecule. And actually, these molecules are not very good for our health because if they pile up in our arteries, it can cause plaque, and then it can just clog up our arteries and give us either a heart attack or a stroke, depending on the location of this plaque. Unsaturated fatty acids, on the other hand, have at least one double bond between the carbons. So in the saturated fatty acids, all of the bonds between the carbons were single bonds. But here between 2 of the carbons, you have a double bond. And this double bond prevents basically additional hydrogens from bonding to those 2 carbons. And as you know, there is some polarity going on here. So the hydrogens attached to the carbons are slightly positively charged because the carbons are kind of stealing the electrons, or like the electrons are gravitating more towards the carbons. And because both of the hydrogens are slightly positive, they kind of repel each other, causing these bends in the unsaturated fatty acid. And that means it cannot really stack on top of other unsaturated fatty acids very well, making it a liquid. And these ones are better for our health because they won't really cause any clogs in our arteries. And yeah, this is basically just summarizing everything I just talked about. And yeah, one important distinction to make is that saturated fatty acids are solid at room temperature. Obviously, you can melt saturated fatty acids, but that won't make it unsaturated fatty acid. And here, another very, very, very important type of lipid called phospholipids. So basically, phospholipids, they have your glycerol molecule, and then they have two fatty acids, and then they also have a phosphate head. And this phosphate head, as we have earlier mentioned, this phosphate head is a functional group. And this phosphate has a charge, it's negatively charged, and which makes it hydrophilic. So the head of a phospholipid is hydrophilic. The fatty acid tails are hydrophobic because they're not charged. And basically, this basically half of the thing is charged and the other half is not charged. We call these types of molecules antipathic. And these are very, very special molecules, these phospholipids, because they make up your cell membrane in what we call the lipid bilayer. And here is a artist rendition of your lipid bilayer. So on the outside of both sides of the lipid bilayer, you have the hydrophilic phosphate heads, and on the inside, that orangey yellow tails, those are the fatty acids, the hydrophobic fatty acids. And basically, that's these phospholipids, like they make themselves into this structure just because of their hydrophobicity or hydrophilicity, I guess. And the hydrophobicity of each of the parts determines what can come in and what cannot come in to the cell membrane directly. So what can get through directly are small, uncharged, and or hydrophobic material, like molecules. For example, carbon dioxide can easily permeate the lipid bilayer, and permeate is just means to penetrate or to get through. And this lipid bilayer is a semi-permeable membrane, which means some things can get in and some things can't. So things that cannot get through directly um, include large molecules, polar molecules, and hydrophilic molecules. So basically these include your big, big carbohydrates like, I don't know, like maybe just like they won't let glucose like pass through directly because that's just very big and it's not small enough to permeate the membrane. Um, but just because it can't get through directly doesn't mean it can't get through at all. As we'll cover later in the series, there are some proteins that act as pumps to pump in molecules that are essential for the cell but can't permeate the membrane directly. The next type of lipids are called waxes. Waxes are made out of a long, long fatty acid chain linked with a long alcohol chain. And alcohol just like, it's not really, basically it's not what you think it is. It's like not your drinking alcohol or anything. The long alcohol chain is just huge groups of carbons bonded to two hydrogens. There's really no need to go that far into the exact chemistry of an alcohol right now. But waxes altogether are degradation resistant and they're waterproof, and they have a high melting point, which makes them these really, really good protective layers, essentially. Next, we have steroids. These are the hormone-like, lipids. Steroids are made out of 4 carbon rings, and some important steroids include cholesterol. Cholesterol is an important part of your cell membrane in that it kind of gives the cell membrane some fluidity. It allows it to, just be more fluid. But we'll get to that more on a later unit. But cholesterol is also a hormone precursor, which means it can easily be changed into other hormones. So there's testosterone, which is the male sex hormone, and estrogen, which is the female sex hormone. And then you have cortisol, which is kind of like your fight or flight hormone. It kind of increases your blood heart rate and gets you ready for, high anxiety situations. And then you have aldosterone. This just maintains water and ion levels in your blood.